Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty interesting. We're talking about views on women's place in society.
Okay.
But the source is kind of unexpected.
Interesting.
It's all coming from social media posts, believe it or not.
Ah,
Yeah, and not just any social media posts.
right?
These are from Iran's supreme leader,
Oh,
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
no kidding.
Yeah, and what makes it even more fascinating is he put these thoughts out there on, wait for it, X Twitter.
That's a choice.
It is, right. And it even posted in multiple languages like Hebrew.
Really? So clearly trying to reach a wider audience.
Exactly. It seems very deliberate, right? Like he wants to shape the conversation globally.
Definitely. I mean, choosing that platform in those languages, that says something for sure.
Absolutely. So let's get into what he actually said.
Okay.
One of the big quotes that really stood out was, "A woman is a delicate flower and not a housemaid."
Interesting.
Yeah. And then he goes on to say, "A woman should be treated like a flower in the home. A flower needs to be cared for. Its freshness and sweet scent should be benefited from and used to perfume the air."
Wow, so very poetic imagery there.
It is, right.
Yeah.
But that whole delicate flower metaphor, it kind of got me thinking.
Yeah.
I've read about how language like that has been used to limit women, to keep them in certain roles.
Right, right.
So I'm curious, from your perspective, what parallels do you see, especially thinking about Iran specifically?
Well, it's complicated for sure, this kind of metaphor. It has deep roots in many different cultures.
I can see that.
On the one hand, you have the beauty and fragility aspect, but then it also implies this need for protection.
Oh, I see.
And that can easily slide into control.
Right?
Now, within Iran specifically, this imagery might resonate with certain groups,
Like, oh,
more conservative groups, those who see women's main role as wives and mothers.
okay, that makes sense.
But at the same time, you can't forget that Iran also has this long history of women fighting for their rights.
Oh, right
Like
on.
even going back to the 1979 revolution, which, yeah, it led to stricter Islamic law. But the early stages, you saw women from all walks of life protesting together, pushing for change.
So there's definitely a tension there.
Absolutely.
You have these different viewpoints within the country.
Exactly. So while some might find this imagery appealing, there are others who are pushing for more autonomy.
Right, more freedom to define their own roles.
Exactly. So it's not a simple picture.
No, not at all. And speaking of challenging expectations, there's this other part of Khamenei's statement that I found interesting.
Okay.
He says, not a housemaid.
Right, right.
So what do you make of that? Is he genuinely trying to say women shouldn't just be stuck doing housework?
It's possible.
Or is it more like he's setting up a different kind of ideal that might still be restrictive in its own way?
I think it's really open to interpretation,
Hmm.
like on the surface.
Yeah.
He seems to be rejecting this idea of women only focused on domestic duties.
I can see that.
But then again, that delicate flower metaphor doesn't exactly shout liberation, does it?
No, not really.
It could be seen as a shift in emphasis
Okay.
from practical tasks to more of an aesthetic role, even emotional.
Oh, interesting.
So less about what a woman does and more about the kind of presence she brings to the home.
That's a good point.
Nurturing, beautiful, supportive, but still within those traditional values.
I see. So it's a subtle distinction.
Very subtle.
And it all kind of makes you think about the bigger picture in Iran right now.
Absolutely.
All the recent protests, the fight for women's rights.
It's a critical moment.
So how do you think different groups within Iran are reacting to Khamenei's statements, especially given all of that?
Well, it's a very charged atmosphere.
Right.
You have young Iranians, especially women, who are bravely challenging the status quo.
Yeah.
They're demanding real change, bodily autonomy, equal rights. They want a say in their future.
Absolutely.
And for them, Khamenei's words might seem out of touch.
Yeah.
They might even fuel the discontent even more.
Pushing them to push harder for change. But then on the other hand, you have those who are already aligned with his ideology.
Right.
And for them, his statements might be seen as confirmation.
Reinforcement.
Yes. And maybe embolden them
Yeah.
to resist the movement for change.
It's a real push and pull, and who knows what the long-term impact will be.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And it gets even more interesting when you look at Khamenei's other tweets,
Yep.
especially the ones in Hebrew, directed at the conflict in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how the enemies are wrong to think the uprising is over, and how he believes young Syrians will liberate the occupied territories.
Strong words.
They are. So do you see any connection between those statements and what he's saying about women?
I think there's definitely a thread there.
What do you mean?
Well, in both cases, he's projecting this image of strength and resilience,
Correct.
both for individuals and for the nation as a whole.
I can see that.
And even that delicate flower metaphor, while it has those potentially limiting interpretations, it also carries this sense of preciousness.
Right, something to be protected.
Exactly. And that aligns with what he's saying about Syria,
Oh,
emphasizing the strength and determination of the Syrian people.
to resist outside forces,
Right. It's all about framing,
presenting this image of defiance against perceived threats.
whether it's Western influence or regional conflicts.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. So, zooming out a bit, what do you think all of this means for the rest of us? What are the implications of Khamenei's statements, both inside Iran and on the world stage?
Well, domestically, I think it's likely to make the divisions in Iranian society even deeper.
How so?
Well, his words could embolden conservative elements, but at the same time, further alienate those pushing for reform.
Right.
And that could have big consequences, both for social stability and the future of the women's rights movement.
Makes sense. And what about internationally?
His pronouncements, especially those in Hebrew, they're going to be scrutinized for sure.
By who?
Everyone, but especially regarding the Syrian conflict and Iran's role there. It could increase tensions with Israel and complicate any attempts at diplomacy to resolve the crisis.
Yeah, it's a reminder that what happens internally can have ripple effects on the global stage.
Absolutely.
So it seems like Khamenei's words, while simple on the surface, actually open up a whole bunch of questions of potential consequences.
They do, and that brings us to a final thought.
Okay.
Something to ponder.
I'm listening.
How do you think these statements are being received by individual women in Iran? Not as a group, but as individuals with their own experiences and hopes and dreams.
That's a good question.
Could these words, meant to define their place, actually spark a new kind of resistance? Push them to define their own place on their own terms?
That's definitely something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
You got it.
Until next time.